Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
The phone call came exactly 7 days before the wedding, just after 7 in the evening, when I'd just gotten off a double shift, my legs sore from standing, my eyes gritty with fatigue, and my shoulders aching in that dull, constant way they do after too many hours in body armor. I was still in uniform, still half covered in the stink of diesel and sweat and gun oil, when her name lit up on the screen. I knew before I answered that she wasn't calling to check in, wasn't calling to say thanks for the RSVP or to ask if I needed a hotel room. She was calling with an agenda. She always called with an agenda. Ash, she started, all sugary tones and clipped syllables, the way someone speaks when they've already rehearsed what they're about to say and don't plan on letting you interrupt. So, I've been thinking about the wedding, and I just wanted to clear something up so there's no confusion, you know? I didn't answer. I let the silence stretch for a beat, just long enough for her to fill it with nervous energy. It's just, she said, already winding herself up, this day is really important to me. Like, incredibly important. It's about me and Jason, and I don't want any distractions. No drama, no speeches that turn into therapy sessions, no big moments that aren't about us. You understand, right? There was a pause. Then, the actual ask landed like a slow slap across the face. I don't want you to wear your police uniform to the wedding, she said, and though her voice was still trying to sound gentle, the words had that hard, cold shape you can't soften no matter how you package them. Or talk about work. At all. It's just not the vibe I'm going for. You get it. I sat back in my chair, closed my eyes for a second, and felt that familiar pressure building behind my ribs, the one that always came after one of her little requests. For as long as I can remember, Emily has had this way of making everything feel like a performance, and I was always cast in the role of supporting character. I was never the pretty one, never the sweet one, never the one mom and dad bragged about at parties. I was the serious one, the hard one, the girl who played tackle football in middle school and didn't cry when she broke her collarbone. I joined the police academy at 22, survived my first shootout at 26, saved a woman and her kid from a hostage situation at 29, and made detective last year. But in Emily's world, none of that ever happened. I was just the sister who brings too much intensity into every room. I didn't say anything right away. I just listened to her breathe, probably expecting me to argue, to defend myself, to fight back, so she could play the victim and tell our mother that I made everything about me again. But I didn't. I just said, okay. She paused, caught off guard. Okay. Sure, I said, standing up, stretching my back. I won't wear my uniform. I won't talk about work. It's your day. She exhaled, a little laugh at the end of it, like she thought she'd won something. Oh good, I just didn't want to have to be, the bad guy. You never are, I said, my tone flat as a parking lot. Have a good night, Emily. And I hung up. The next morning, I pulled out my dress uniform from the back of the closet, polished navy fabric, crisp lines, every medal and bar earned with blood, sweat, or worse. I laid it on the bed and stared at it for a long time. I didn't need to say a single word about my job at that wedding. I just needed to wear the truth. It's funny, growing up, Emily used to throw tantrums if anyone else got attention. At her 10th birthday party, she made me go sit in the garage because my science fair trophy ruined her moment. When our dad passed, she gave a eulogy that didn't mention me once. When I graduated from the academy, she didn't even show up, said it made her uncomfortable to be around guns and cop stuff. She's always tried to erase me quietly, like I was a smudge on the family portrait she wanted to present to the world. So when she said don't wear the uniform, I knew it wasn't about the aesthetic or vibes. It was about control. It was about making sure that even on the biggest day of her life, I was still small, still tucked neatly into a background where I couldn't overshadow her glow. But here's the thing about glow, it's only impressive in darkness. And I had spent my whole damn life walking through fire. I didn't shine, I burned. Still, I wasn't going to cause a scene. I wasn't going to make a speech or draw attention or even correct the cousins who always asked if I was still working security somewhere. No, I was going to keep my promise. I wasn't going to mention my job at all. I was just going to show up, dressed as who I am, and let the room do the talking. Because when you walk into a room wearing 15 years of sacrifice and service on your chest, the people who matter tend to notice. And the ones who don't? Well, that's the beginning of a much bigger story. But for now, I'll leave you with this. What would you have done in my shoes? If your sibling told you to shrink yourself for their moment, if they asked you to hide the thing you've dedicated your life to, the thing that's almost cost you your life more than once, would you still go? Would you keep your promise? Or would you show up exactly as you are? Because I did. And it changed everything. There's a certain kind of silence that settles in after a conversation like the one I had with Emily, and it isn't the peaceful kind that wraps around you at the end of a long day when the dishes are done and the lights are low, no. This kind of silence hums with tension, a low, vibrating reminder that something unsaid is still hanging in the air, coiled and ready to snap the moment you let your guard down. For the next few days after that call, I found myself replaying her words over and over again, not because they shocked me, they didn't, but because of how familiar they felt, how perfectly they encapsulated everything that had always been broken between us. It wasn't the first time she had told me to stay quiet, to shrink, to step aside so she could have her moment, and I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that it wouldn't be the last. Growing up with Emily as a sister was a lot like living next to a wildfire that only looked beautiful from far away. From a distance, she was radiant, all golden hair and big smiles and charisma that could charm the teeth out of a snake. Our neighbors loved her. Our teachers adored her. Even the grocery clerks remembered her favorite snacks. But when you got close, when you saw the way she scorched everything that threatened to cast a shadow over her light, you realized that her shine came at a cost, and more often than not, that cost was me. I was the older sister by 3 years, and from the moment she was born, it felt like I was being asked to step aside. At first, it was innocent enough, people cooing over the baby, saying how cute she was, how lucky I was to have a little sister, but it didn't take long for the comparisons to start. Emily was delicate where I was strong, charming where I was serious, fashionable where I was practical. She had ballet recitals and birthday parties with themes and princess dresses that twirled just right when she spun. I had scraped knees, bruised shins, and a baseball glove that I wouldn't give up for anything. Our parents never said it out loud, but I could hear it in their tone, see it in their eyes. She was easy to love, and I was easy to overlook. I remember once, during middle school, when I got into a fight on the bus because a boy made a crude comment about one of the freshman girls. I didn't hesitate, I broke his nose, clean and fast, and when the principal called home, my mom's first question wasn't whether I was okay or why it had happened, but what Emily's teachers would think when they heard about it. "Your sister is on the cheerleading squad," she'd said, pinching the bridge of her nose like I'd given her a migraine. "Can't you just try not to make things harder for her?" That's what it always boiled down to, not making things harder for Emily. My job, whether I liked it or not, was to stay out of the way. And so I learned to live quietly. I stopped bringing home certificates or photos from training, stopped talking about the ugly things I saw on the job, stopped expecting anyone in the family to ask how I was doing. I didn't need applause or praise, I got enough of that on the street, from the people who knew what it meant to do what I did, but it would have been nice, just once, to feel like my sister saw me as more than an inconvenience. But that wasn't who Emily was. Emily was the kind of person who could twist kindness into a weapon and wield it with the precision of a surgeon. She never raised her voice, never threw things, never called me names. Instead, she made suggestions. She offered advice. She framed everything in the language of concern and love, so that when I pushed back, I looked like the ungrateful one. And now, with her wedding approaching, she was doing it again, wrapping her demand in the soft fabric of sisterly affection, making it seem like a reasonable request instead of what it truly was, a boundary drawn in spite, not love. The thing is, I understood weddings. I've worked enough domestic calls to know that weddings are pressure cookers disguised in white lace and floral arrangements, and I wasn't naive enough to think that this one would be any different. But what I hadn't expected, what still managed to sting, even after all this time, was that she wouldn't want me there as I am. Not as the woman I fought to become, Not as the sister who stood in the rain holding a mother's hand while they pulled a lifeless child from a pond. Not as the detective who's worked cold cases until her eyes burned from staring at paper, but as something smaller, softer, more palatable to the guests she cared so much about impressing. She didn't say, "Don't come." She didn't have to. What she said was, "Don't be you." And somehow, that hurt more. The next night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at an old photo I kept tucked into the corner of my fridge with a cracked magnet from a long-defunct pizza place. It was from my academy graduation, me in uniform, my father next to me, proud in a way he never was with words, only with presence. He passed 3 years ago, but I still remembered how he looked at me that day, like he was seeing me for the first time. He would have told me to wear the uniform. Hell, he would have insisted on it. And if he were still here, I have no doubt Emily wouldn't have dared ask me otherwise. But he wasn't here anymore, which meant I had to choose for myself. And I did. Because what kind of sister tells you not to be proud of your life? What kind of sister can't stomach a moment where someone else gets noticed for something real, something earned, not bought or painted on or borrowed from a Pinterest board? What kind of sister doesn't clap when you walk into the room, not because you're stealing anything, but because you've survived something? I knew the answer. The question was, would anyone else? I folded the photo, slid it into the inside pocket of my dress uniform jacket, and zipped the garment bag shut. Let her have the flowers. Let her have the speeches. Let her have the photos and the vows and the cake made with 6 layers of pretension. I'd have the truth. And that, I was starting to realize, would be more than enough. The morning of the wedding broke not with the soft, golden promise of a day meant for love and celebration, but with a thick, gray stillness that clung to everything like a warning, the kind of heavy calm that always precedes a storm. Not the loud kind that screams through the sky and rattles windows, but the quiet kind that sneaks up behind you with cold fingers and a sharp whisper that says, "Watch closely, something's about to shift." I'd been awake for hours before the sun even thought about rising, not because I couldn't sleep, I hadn't even tried, but because part of me had known that today wouldn't unfold the way anyone had planned, and I wasn't about to be caught off guard. The uniform was already hanging on the back of the door, freshly pressed, every bar and ribbon exactly where it needed to be, boots shined to a dark, mirrored sheen that reflected back only the person I had built myself into, piece by piece, through years of doing what no one else in my family had the stomach to even ask about. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't rehearse anything to say. I didn't bring a +1 or call anyone to let them know I'd be arriving in full dress blues. I simply zipped the bag, checked the fit one last time, pinned the medal my father once held in his hand to the left side of my chest, and walked out the door like I was heading into any other kind of war. I arrived 15 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start, not because I wanted attention, and not because I needed to make a scene, but because I knew enough about people to understand the power of timing. Arriving too early would give her time to react privately, to panic in corners and corral her bridesmaids into running interference. Arriving too late would look like a stunt. But arriving exactly when people were settling in, when they were turning in their seats to glance toward the back of the church in anticipation of something beautiful walking down the aisle, that was something entirely different. That was surgical. I walked in alone, the echo of my boots on the polished floor like a drumbeat in a space that had gone suddenly, unnaturally silent. You could hear the shift happen first, just a flicker of movement from a few heads in the back row, then a ripple that spread up the pews like a shiver through a body, and then, without any prompting, without a word spoken, they began to rise. One by one, row after row, people stood. A few in confusion, a few in clear recognition, but most, and I could tell from the way their faces changed, stood out of something deeper, something that lives in the chest when you see a uniform worn by someone who has earned the right to carry it. A couple of older men, veterans I recognized vaguely from family barbecues and Memorial Day gatherings, nodded toward me in that wordless, brother-in-arms kind of way that says more than a speech ever could. Even the organist faltered, hands hovering above the keys, unsure whether to keep playing or wait. The only one who didn't move was Emily. She stood at the front of the church, framed by flowers and candles and the kind of dramatic lighting designed to make any bride look angelic, but the effect on her face was far from divine. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She didn't shift her weight or clasp her hands or look at the man beside her. She just stared at me like she was seeing a ghost or, worse, a mirror. And what she saw there must have terrified her. The groom, Jason, a kind enough man who always seemed a bit too eager to please, a little too polished around the edges, turned his head toward me, eyebrows lifting in surprise, and I saw it immediately. The recognition, the calculation, the subtle realization that there was a story here he hadn't been told. He leaned toward her slightly, said something low and quick, and though I couldn't hear the words, I could read the stiffening in her shoulders like a headline. I said nothing. I kept walking until I reached my seat, third pew on the left, not front and center, not hidden in the back, and I sat, back straight, legs squared, eyes forward. I didn't need to smile. I didn't need to gesture or even meet anyone's gaze. The uniform had already done the talking. And God, it had spoken loud. I could feel it, the subtle current in the room beginning to shift, the whispers starting low and curling like smoke around the edges of the ceremony. An aunt leaned into another guest, eyes wide as she asked something under her breath. A cousin nudged her husband and tilted her head toward me, her expression unreadable but undeniably curious. No one had expected this. Not from me. Not from the sister who, for years, had been edited out of the family narrative like a bad photo, the one who never showed up in the framed pictures on the mantel, who rarely made it into the holiday newsletters, who was always off working, or just so busy with the department. They'd seen the uniform before, in passing. Maybe on a Facebook post someone else had tagged me in. Maybe at Dad's funeral, though that day had been such a haze I doubted anyone remembered much past the casket and the speeches. But today they saw it properly. They saw me properly. And Emily hated it. I didn't gloat. I didn't look at her or try to meet her eyes. I wasn't here to prove anything to her, not really. I was here because I had made a promise. I wouldn't mention my job. And I hadn't. Not once. Not in conversation. Not in greeting. Not in any performative display of accomplishment. I had simply walked in, silent and composed, wearing the truth of my life on my sleeve. It was the others who made it a moment. And that, more than anything I could have said, stripped the power right out of her hands. I watched her as the officiant cleared his throat, tried to bring the room back into focus. Her smile wobbled at the corners. Her hand trembled slightly in Jason's. And as she began to recite her vows, words written and rewritten to sound flawless and poetic, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not even jealousy, but fear. Fear that, for the first time, her light wasn't the brightest in the room. And she was right. Because when every damn head turned, it wasn't for her. And she knew it. There's something disturbingly intimate about being pulled into a confrontation inside a bathroom, especially at a wedding, where every tile echoes like a confession, and the hum of the crowd outside becomes this muffled, distant soundtrack to something far more raw. Something unedited and too real to be hidden behind champagne toasts and perfectly arranged centerpieces. When I followed Emily through the side hallway, the one where the florists had stashed their empty boxes and someone had left a half-finished glass of rose perched precariously on a windowsill, I wasn't walking with anger, and I certainly wasn't looking for a fight. I was walking with the calm of someone who had long since stopped trying to explain herself, someone who had spent years mastering the art of silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had finally understood the futility of speaking truth to someone determined not to hear it. The door to the bridal suite slammed behind us with a violence that didn't match the delicate, lacy aesthetic of the room, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence, thick and charged, pressed down on everything, the vanity covered in highlighters and lipsticks, the bouquet discarded on a velvet stool, the veil draped over a chair like a ghost that had been shrugged off too quickly. And then, like a dam breaking, she turned to me with eyes that were no longer sparkling with bride-like joy, but burning with something sharper, meaner, the kind of fury that only grows in the shadow of wounded pride. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she spat, her voice trembling at the edges, not with sadness or fear, but with the kind of rage that comes from realizing that the version of the day you'd rehearsed in your head is slipping further and further out of your control with every second. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just watched her, not out of coldness, but because I knew, better than anyone, how Emily's storms worked. They weren't like the fast, violent tempests that come and go with lightning and thunder. No, hers were slow burns, furnace-hot behind closed doors, always wrapped in just enough justification to make her feel like the victim, even when she was the one holding the match. "You said you wouldn't mention your job," she hissed, and now the tears were starting to form, though I could tell they were more from fury than sorrow. "You promised. You told me, you said you wouldn't make it about you." I didn't say a word, I replied, and my voice, even to me, sounded too calm, too quiet to match the chaos she was flinging around the room. I walked in. That's all. "Oh, don't you play that game," she snapped, pacing now, her heels clicking against the tiled floor like gunshots. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You showed up like a goddamn war hero, and suddenly everyone's crying and clapping and whispering about how proud they are of you, and how brave you are, and oh, look at Ashley in her uniform, isn't she amazing?" She mimicked the voices with a sneer, but behind the mimicry, there was something unmistakable. Desperation. Not just for attention, she'd always had that, but for control. For narrative. For the ability to mold the story of her day exactly how she'd imagined it, with every glance, every compliment, every photograph tailored to fit the version of herself she wanted the world to see. "You told me not to talk about my job," I said, slowly now, carefully. And I didn't. I haven't said a damn thing about it all day. I didn't even speak during the ceremony. The only people who made it a moment were the ones who stood up. She threw her bouquet then, not at me, not quite, but in my direction, so that it hit the wall to my left and dropped onto the floor like something broken. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just ugly. "God, you ruin everything," she whispered, and this time her voice cracked for real. "You always have. You're like this walking, looming presence that sucks the air out of every room, and you think you're being noble and quiet, but really you're just exhausting." I didn't flinch. I didn't tell her she was wrong, because I knew, deep down, that in her mind she wasn't. She was speaking her truth, the version of events she'd built up for years, brick by brick, until it formed the only reality she could live in, one where I had always been the difficult one, the complicated one, the one who made life harder, not easier. But truth isn't a mirror, it's a prism. And what she saw as sabotage was, to me, the final line in a lifetime of passive betrayals I had simply chosen to stop absorbing. "You asked me not to take the spotlight," I said, turning toward the door, ready to leave her with the silence she clearly couldn't stomach. "But, Emily, you never let me have it in the first place." That stopped her cold. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw something flicker behind her fury that resembled recognition, a dim, reluctant awareness that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about a dress or a job or a wedding, but about a lifetime of pretending I didn't exist as fully as she did. That flicker didn't last long. She blinked, swallowed it down, and said the one thing I'll never forget, not because of what it meant, but because of how much it revealed. "You should go," she said, voice low and trembling. "Just leave. I don't want you here anymore." I nodded, not in defeat, but in understanding. And then, without a word, I turned and walked out, past the bathroom, down the hallway, and through the echoing corridor where a few guests were still lingering, half curious, half embarrassed, pretending not to notice the tension in the air. As I passed a bridesmaid, Jenna, I think, one of the quieter ones who always seemed unsure of her place in Emily's universe, she touched my arm lightly and whispered, "Thank you for coming. My dad was watching you the whole time. He told me you were the only one he respects." I didn't reply. I just kept walking. And in that moment, something in me, something I hadn't even realized was still tied up in needing her approval, finally snapped free. Because if the only thing I had done to ruin her day was show up as myself, in a uniform that spoke of sacrifice, discipline, and survival, then maybe it was never my presence that was the problem. Maybe it was her absence of substance. And that kind of emptiness? No amount of lace or lighting or perfectly arranged centerpieces could ever hide. There's a strange sort of quiet that follows a confrontation, not the silence of peace or the lull that comes from resolution, but rather the heavy, aching stillness that descends when the last word has been spoken, the last door shut, and all that remains is the echo of choices made with a clarity that can't be undone. As I stepped out of that hallway and into the soft din of the reception hall, where laughter mingled awkwardly with clinking glasses, and the band played a too cheerful melody to a crowd that was pretending not to notice the tension crackling just beneath the surface, I didn't feel triumphant, and I certainly didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired, not physically, but in that soul-deep way that comes when you finally stop hoping that someone will become the version of themselves you've been waiting to meet for years. The reception had already begun, though the energy in the room was noticeably off-kilter, as if everyone sensed something unscripted had just occurred behind the scenes. The kind of moment that doesn't get captured in the photo album, but will be whispered about long after the flowers wilt and the cake's been eaten. I made my way to the same seat I'd claimed before the ceremony, ignoring the glances that flicked in my direction like moths to a quiet flame, and I sat with the same quiet composure I'd carried all day, not because I was trying to make a statement, but because I had already made it without uttering a single damn word. I watched as guests avoided eye contact with Emily, as her bridesmaids circled her like anxious satellites, whispering hurried reassurances while glancing toward me, as if I might erupt or collapse or suddenly turn the entire night into a scene. But I wasn't there to play the villain in her drama. I wasn't interested in stealing any more moments. What I had come to understand, somewhere between that bathroom door slamming shut and the tight squeeze of Jenna's hand on my arm, was that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do, especially when someone has spent their life trying to minimize you, is to simply exist, fully and unapologetically, in a space they tried to keep you out of. The speeches began with the best man, whose nervous jokes fell flat against the strange hush in the room, followed by a tearful, slightly slurred toast from one of Emily's college friends who had clearly started drinking too early. The maid of honor spoke next, recounting stories of Emily's teenage years, carefully curated memories that painted her as sweet, spontaneous, and impossibly generous, a version of my sister that existed only in curated snapshots, not in the messy reality I had spent a lifetime navigating. I sat quietly through it all, not clapping, not smiling, just watching, wondering how many people in this room had ever really seen her without the mask. And then she stood, Emily, to give her bride speech, a tradition she had insisted upon during planning, because of course she wanted the final word. She held her glass delicately, her face a masterclass in composure, the perfect picture of bridal elegance, but I knew her well enough to see the tightness in her jaw, the flicker of something sharp behind her carefully arranged smile. Her voice, when it came, was smooth, practiced, and utterly detached. I just want to thank everyone for being here today, she began, scanning the room with an air of control that only someone obsessed with perception could wield so effortlessly. It means the world to me, to have so many friends and family come together for such a beautiful celebration. There was polite applause, the kind that fills silence out of obligation rather than enthusiasm. She continued, weaving through her speech with the grace of someone who had spent weeks perfecting it, name-dropping old friends, thanking the vendors, praising her new in-laws, and giving Jason a well-rehearsed smile as she called him her greatest adventure. But never once, not a single word, did she mention me. Not by name. Not even as my sister. It was a deliberate erasure, one final attempt to reclaim the spotlight, to undo the moment she couldn't control. She was pretending I didn't exist. But the room knew better. They'd seen. They'd stood. And no amount of selective storytelling could erase the image of the woman in uniform who had walked in without fanfare and left the air different just by being present. I didn't leave early, despite the growing discomfort Emily clearly felt every time our eyes almost met. I stayed. I danced with our uncle, the one who used to call me Sergeant, with a proud smirk even before I made detective, and shared a slice of cake with my niece, who asked if I had ever driven a tank and giggled when I told her tanks weren't exactly part of the city police budget. I smiled politely at distant relatives, nodded at coworkers of Emily's who seemed more interested in asking me about my job than talking about floral arrangements, and I sat quietly when the first dance began, watching her twirl under the lights in a dress that probably cost more than my car. But the real moment, the one I'll remember long after the photographs are forgotten and the video reel is buried beneath 100 social media posts, came later, when the crowd had thinned, when the wine had been poured too freely, and the band had slipped into that familiar rhythm of nostalgic, low-tempo classics. A slow song began, something old and soft and impossibly sentimental, and I stood, almost without thinking, walking toward the edge of the dance floor just as my father's old friend, Richard, a Vietnam vet with shaky hands and too many ghosts, rose unsteadily from his seat and held out his hand to me with a grin that split his weathered face. "Care for a dance, officer?" he asked, and though the words were light, there was something solemn behind them, the kind of gesture that meant more than it looked. I nodded, took his hand, and let him lead me, slowly and carefully, in a dance that wasn't elegant or rehearsed, but steady and real. The crowd watched not in awe, not in judgment, but in quiet, reflective silence, as if something was being acknowledged that no one quite had the vocabulary to explain. Emily didn't join the floor. She stood off to the side, watching with that same unreadable expression, her hands clutched tightly around a glass of untouched champagne. When the song ended, Richard patted my shoulder, whispered something about how proud my father would have been, and shuffled off with tears in his eyes. I didn't stay much longer after that. Before I left, I returned to my seat, reached into my bag, and pulled out a small framed photo, the one I had tucked into my uniform pocket earlier, the one of me and Dad on the day I graduated from the academy. Him in his favorite flannel and me in a uniform that still looked too big for my shoulders. I placed it gently on the table, angled just right so that if Emily ever bothered to look, she'd see it staring back at her. I walked out alone into the night without saying goodbye. And you know what? It didn't feel like leaving. It felt like arriving, not at a destination, but at a truth I'd spent my whole life walking toward, that the loudest kind of revenge isn't rage or insult or confrontation, it's grace. It's refusing to disappear when someone demands your absence. It's standing in the space you were told not to occupy and saying nothing, because your presence already said it all. She wanted the day to be about her. And it was. But now, when people talk about her wedding, when they remember that afternoon with the gold chairs and the too fancy hors d'oeuvres and the carefully arranged playlist, they'll remember the woman in the uniform who walked in, said nothing, and changed everything. And that, whether she'll admit it or not, was the moment that stole the show.